My name's Bruce Hopkins. On May the 8th of this year, 2018, I completed my tramp of Te Araroa, the long pathway of New Zealand. This took me along beaches, through forests, across rivers and mountain divides, the length of New Zealand. As a 62-year-old novice tramper, it was a challenge and took me to the edge of my limits. Many times throughout this, my mind actually went to Ed Hillary. I had reasonably good technology and the latest gear. I couldn't believe that back in 1953, with the latest of technology that they had back then, Ed and his team were able to achieve what they achieved in ascending Mt Everest. Here's Ed's story. I was 15 years old when Edmund Hillary made the first ascent of Everest with Tenzing Norgay on the 29th of May, 1953. I had placed a bet that the attempt would fail. 9 previous efforts had come to nothing. Why should a 10th fare any better? Even when I was proved wrong, I still had no understanding of why 1953 was different. I came closer 7 years later when Ed invited me to spend 9 months in the Himalayas on his Silver Hunt expedition of 1960-61. This was an expedition that began with a Yeti hunt but moved on to the more serious business of studying high-altitude physiology in a laboratory on a high snowfield in the heart of the Everest region. We went on a test ourselves, disastrously, with an oxygenless attempt on Mount Makalu, 5th highest peak in the world. I learned that oxygen was a key player in the high-altitude game. My qualifications for the expedition were that I had climbed widely in New Zealand, had a degree in physiology, and was halfway through a medical degree. During the 3 months before the expedition, Ed and his wife Louise generously invited me to join them on a trip to the home of the sponsors in Chicago, and to London, where I worked in Dr. Griffith Pugh's physiology laboratory. I met famous Everesters whose books I had read: Eric Shipton, John Hunt, George Lowe, Mike Ward, James Morris. Ed and Louise took me with them to Chamonix in the French Alps. They were great fun. During the years that followed, Ed invited me on more than a dozen expeditions. It was a friendship that lasted until Louise's death in 1975 and continued in an attenuated form through to Ed's death in 2008. As with so many people, he shaped my life. What makes me believe that I have something new to say about Edmund Hillary? He writes his own story in his autobiographies. He always preferred his own version of his life. As he said to journalist Pat Booth, who published an unauthorized biography in 1991, "I write my own books." In 2009, a year after Ed's death, I was writing a book about his aid work in Nepal. Between 1961 and 2003, he had bequeathed his papers and photos to the Auckland Museum, and for my research, I had access not only to this huge archive, but also to private letters between Louise and Ed, which were held by Peter and Sarah Hillary. Ed always acknowledged the central importance of Louise in their shared life, but without much detail. In the archive, she enters Ed's life as a lively 21-year-old in a ski club hut on Mount Ruapehu. On his way to Everest in 1953, he is meeting her for a weekend in Sydney, and he writes to her throughout the expedition. 3 months after the famous climb, they marry and enjoy an extended honeymoon as part of a lecture tour through the UK, Europe, and the USA. Through the rest of the decade, Louise is at home, raising 3 children. But in 1961, after a trek into the Everest country, she joins him as a full partner in helping bring education and health to the Sherpas. There were surprises in the museum archive. Ed's father, Percy, has written Chapter 2 for me in the form of a diary of describing the excitement of going to war in 1915 and the horror of the reality of Gallipoli. Percy is clearly the father of the son who becomes a conscientious objector in the war that starts in 1939. Ed teaches radiant living and for a year in 1940 to 41, he runs a young citizens session on national radio each Sunday. When finally he enters the Air Force, his life of adventure begins. In box 24 of the archive, 1965, there is an unpublished novel, Call Not to the Gods, under the nom de plume Gary Sankar. Through the archive, I became immersed in the life of Ed Hillary. Like him, I am a New Zealander, born in Auckland. Though I am 18 years younger, the social and physical environment he grew up in is recognisably mine. New Zealand is small, and in the days before air travel was usual, it was a long way from the rest of the world. There are many biographies of famous men. This is mine, and it reflects how I saw Edmund Hillary during the time I knew him. It is not the complete story. The years after 1980 are too recent for me to attempt to cover them satisfactorily. The years of Ed's marriage to June Lady Hillary will have their own biographer. One of the fascinations of Ed's life is the way he handled his fame and came to be recognised as the person who best represented the essence and spirit of New Zealand. It has been a rare privilege to have entered his remarkable life through those old letters and photos, as well as my own memories and those of others who knew him. Michael Gill, Auckland, 2017.